two nationally recognized experts on the topic of entrepreneurism. Dr. Marianne Feldman from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Dane Stangler from the Kansas City-based Kauffman Foundation. Both Dane and Marianne are going to take us behind the scenes of what's happening in the states to promote and sustain entrepreneurship, why entrepreneurship is important, and focus a little on how you can get started in creating an entrepreneurial culture in your state. Those of you who have registered for today's webinar will have a unique opportunity to ask our very knowledgeable panelists a question. Following their presentations, we'll have them field as many questions as we have time for. Since we have so many joining on the webinar today, the way we'll handle Q&A is you can type in a question right here on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. There is a box down below that says Questions, which you can expand and you can enter your question there. We will then collect and pass the questions along to our panelists. If you're having a technical issue or want to ask the CSG staff a question, you can also ask us in the chat window, which is below the questions panel. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dane Stangler. Dane serves as a director at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, where he provides research and writing on a wide variety of subjects, including entrepreneurship, expeditionary economics, and cities. Dane initiated and now manages the Kauffman Foundation Research Series on firm formation and economic growth and contributes regularly to the blog Growthology, which can be found online at growthology.org. He also serves as an advisor to the Foundation's president on matters relating to strategy and programming. Dane has his bachelor's from Truman State University and a JD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So Dane, thank you very much for being here with us, and just let us know when you need us to advance your slides, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Is this clear?
It is.
Okay, well I thought I'd just, well first of all, thank you to CSG for inviting Kauffman to participate. I thought I'd just start with a couple brief remarks about the Kauffman Foundation itself. As some of you may know, we are a private philanthropic foundation based in Kansas City, devoted to two primary areas of grant making, education, and entrepreneurship. In both those areas, we fund and conduct a wide range of research. We also fund and operate a number of programs, and if anyone wants more information on some of those things, on some of our grants and some of our programs, either in education or entrepreneurship, I'd be happy to elaborate on them, or you can go on the website. I think what's most important to note about the Kauffman Foundation is the importance that we place and that comes directly from our donor on entrepreneurship as a vital force in the economy. Like many philanthropists who subsequently establish philanthropic foundations, Mr. Kauffman, Ewing Kauffman, our donor, was a successful entrepreneur. You find this throughout the 20th century. Henry Ford, John Rockefeller, Bill Gates. These were all entrepreneurs. Unlike many of these entrepreneurs turned philanthropists, Mr. Kauffman saw that it was not only entrepreneurship, the founding, the building of a business that allowed him to then give back. It was also the environment in which he operated, the freedom to start a company, the incentives facing him, and the entire institutional environment, the local, state, and national levels of the United States that really allowed him to do this. And he placed a premium on improving that institutional environment, but also, in his words, really democratizing the ability of people to become entrepreneurs. So that's sort of the perspective from which we view things. On the next slide, it's just sort of an overview of what I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to be very brief. I know Marianne has probably a lot smarter things than I have to say, and we want to leave plenty of time for questions. So the first thing on the size and age of businesses, as John pointed out at the beginning, on the next slide you can sort of see the existing distribution of employment for one of the most recent years for which statistics are available from the census. And the policy dialogue, both at the state level as well as the national level, we often get into this dichotomy between small business and large business, small business versus big business. And that's not wrong, but it reflects more the existing distribution of companies and employment rather than sort of the annual flow into and out of the job market. So as you can see, as everyone knows, we have lots and lots of small businesses in this country, but they actually account for they account for a much smaller percentage of employment than their volume indicates. They're about 99%, 99.99% of all firms, but they account for about 50% of employment. And some of the research that we've done, some of the research that we have funded has tried to focus more, tried to dig a little deeper and see where we get that annual incremental addition of new jobs. And on the next slide, you can see that some of the research that we funded at the Census Bureau has highlighted that the age of firms, the age of businesses may be more relevant, maybe more telling than the size of businesses. The Census Bureau researchers have shown that it's young firms, and they define young as those between the ages of 0 and 5, young firms that account for most net job creation, that is the annual additional increment of net new jobs in the economy. The reason this is important is not to sort of belittle the importance of small business or to sort of say that that's an erroneous dichotomy, but it's just to show that there's another dimension to talk about job creation rather than just the size of businesses, and that has an important policy implication because obviously a new business or a young business is most often small. You don't start with 1,000 employees, but a small business that's 25 years old is going to face much different incentives and respond to policies much differently than a firm that's the same size but is only 2 years old. And when we talk about the importance of new and young businesses to job creation, lots of people, the rebuttal is often, yes, they create lots of jobs in their first 5 years, but then those jobs disappear. They're not enduring, or they're not durable, or they're not as good as those created by older firms. Then the next slide, we actually have addressed this issue, and a couple of our researchers have actually charted sort of the life cycle of employment in young firms, and what this shows is that the bottom line, the black line, is that while firms disappear at a pretty steady pace after about 5 years, 50% of new firms survive to about 5 years, and then it goes out to about 25 years. Actually, jobs stick around at a much higher rate than firms. So you can see that at year 5, while only 50%, while only half of the companies founded in any given year are still around, 80% of those jobs that they brought into existence are still around, indicating that those firms that do survive, those young firms, are creating jobs at a quite fast rate to compensate for those being destroyed by the firms that are closing. So, it's not entirely true that jobs created in new and young businesses aren't important or aren't going to stick around. They are quite enduring. In terms of sort of the direction in which entrepreneurship in the U.S. is trending, or sort of its current state, the Kauffman Foundation funds and publishes something we call the Kauffman Index of Entrepreneurial Activity, and the most recent findings are displayed on the next slide from our reports a month or two ago. And this shows the overall rate of entrepreneurial activity in the United States, and you can see that since 1996, this has been about 14 or 15 years, the rate at which Americans create business it's pretty steady. It doesn't change much from year to year, and this is entirely consistent with other data sets. However, in the last 3 years, so 2008, 2009, 2010, you see actually a sharp uptick, and this is almost entirely recession-driven in terms of people who were laid off. You can see in the demographic data in terms of people with the least amount of education in certain sectors like construction that were hardest hit by the recession. And so where we are now is we're sort of at this paradox where the recession has driven many, many people to start businesses, which on one hand is a good thing. I don't think any of us would fault someone for taking their future into their own hands when they're faced with the severity of this most recent recession. At the same time, as we'll see in a later slide toward the end of the presentation, many of these businesses being started are one-person shops. They're sole proprietorships or self-employment or what are called non-employers. And so in terms of job creation, we're not getting the same bang from new businesses that we have in the past. And so this is both a short-term problem in that the cyclical nature of recession and recovery should lead to more solid business formation. But as we'll see later, it's also a long-term issue in terms of the demographics of the country. And so what I want to turn to next, and Mary Ann's going to cover a lot of this territory, is some of the data that we have, and that's, it's not universal, but some of the data on the distribution of entrepreneurship across the country. And so in the next slide is just a map from our Kauffman Index of entrepreneurial activity. And I think this matches up with most people's expectations in terms of the darkest states are where you see the highest rates of entrepreneurial activity, and progressively to the lighter states where you sort of see the least. I don't think this is surprising at all, and in fact, in the next slide, you can see that the breakdown by region. And I think not surprisingly, the South and West, which have been growing the most in terms of population, have seen the largest number of new businesses come into existence. And then further on in the next slide, you see sort of a similar breakdown in terms of metropolitan areas. Unfortunately, the economist Rob Fairley, who does the analysis for us, only does the 15 largest metropolitan areas in the country. But I think it's still interesting, in terms of looking at this, in terms of growth rates and sort of distribution of population. I don't think there's anything particularly shocking. What I think is sort of slightly more telling is when you dig down to the types of businesses, and that's the map that's shown in the next slide. And this is only tech and engineering companies founded from the decade 95 to 05. And I think, when you talk about technology and engineering companies in the U.S., we all sort of tend to default to, the sort of the conventional hotspots of Silicon Valley, Austin, increasingly Boise. But here you see, the distribution of tech and engineering companies, what we usually take to be some of our most innovative companies, is it's all over the place. It's all over the country, and the reasons vary by locality, by municipality. But it's simply not the case that we sort of have these only 2 or 3 pockets of technology innovation, and then everyone else has to either give up or sort of try to imitate Silicon Valley. This becomes extremely important when we talk about sort of the demographics of entrepreneurship, which is what I want to talk about next. And the technology and engineering breakdown is especially important in terms of when you look at who is starting those companies. The next slide shows the overall breakdown between what's called in the Kauffman Index, the native-born versus immigrants. And there's no question in terms of recent trends that immigrants have been creating businesses at a faster rate than native-born Americans. This is both for population reasons, we have more immigrants, but also the rate of native-born entrepreneurship hasn't moved for about 15 years, and you see this again in the next slide where you see immigrants have a larger share of new businesses in the country. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this is especially important when you talk about tech and engineering companies. If you look at the geographic distribution of those tech and engineering companies, and then you look at who founds them, which is in the next slide, you can see that immigrants have been hugely important in terms of founding or co-founding those companies that we typically take to be the most innovative in contributing to economic growth. And overall, in that decade, 95 to 05, they accounted for about 1/4 of technology and engineering companies. And clearly it varies by geography, but you see this all over the country. And I think the title of this slide sort of says it all. I mean, if we're looking for sort of the low-hanging fruit of promoting innovation, promoting entrepreneurship, easiest steps to take, immigration sort of jumps to the top of the list. Many of these immigrants who founded these companies came and studied here. They, were awarded degrees at our universities, and they've stuck around, and they're very much making jobs for Americans. They're not taking jobs. There is some pending legislation in Washington, the Startup Visa Act, that would sort of lower some of the barriers and make it easier for immigrants to come here and start companies, and it's a hugely important first step. There's obviously a lot more to do. It becomes a much thornier issue, obviously, at the state level, where the scope for action on the immigration front is quite limited compared to other areas. However, some states have already sort of taken upon themselves to start designing programs for legal immigration on an employment status. I think Utah was in the midst of writing some legislation along these lines not long ago. The other demographic trend that I wanted to highlight has to do with age, and you can just run through sort of the next 4 slides. This is just the basic population distribution of the U.S. as it changes over time. I don't think it's surprising to anyone. We all know we have an aging society, and this dominates the headlines. It's often painted, however, as sort of this looming fiscal and economic and social disaster for the country. And I don't want to underplay the fiscal ramifications of an aging population, but if you go to the next slide and sort of look at the distribution of who is starting companies in the U.S., you actually see that those older age groups, people in their 40s, people in their 50s, are the ones who are starting many of these companies. Now, the immediate rebuttal to that we get is, okay, well, yes, but 55-year-olds are not starting innovative companies. And actually, if you drill down again to those tech and engineering companies, you do see that the average age of those tech founders is 40, and that there are many more founders over 50 than there are under 30. And so I think that, and sort of we think that the emerging demographic trends of the U.S. are, while still unfavorable in a macroeconomic sense, do have some favorable dimensions to them in terms of, if we have an aging population, and this is what the trends look like, we might expect that we're on the cusp of sort of a mini entrepreneurship boom. And the next slide just reinforces the point of how entrepreneurship, or how new business creation has changed over time, at least over the last 15 years, where you see that they're very much mirroring the general population and getting older over time. I think worryingly, from a policy perspective, especially from a state level, the next slide, actually the next 2 slides, as I conclude this, the slide just before that shows a different dimension in terms of the age, where you can see this convergence among all age groups. And I say this is worrying because if you look at that blue line, which is the youngest age group, those ages 20 to 34, that's the demographic group that is thought to be, both in just stereotypical terms or in a lot of the research, that is taken to be the most innovative potential group of entrepreneurs. But as you can see, the rate of business creation in that age group has fallen over time. And we have fewer entrepreneurs among that age group than we once did. This despite an enormous expenditure of effort, especially on college campuses, in terms of promoting and boosting entrepreneurship. In the Kauffman Foundation, we have been at the fore of that in terms of trying to get entrepreneurship across campuses and really promoting it among students. And you don't see at least the fruits of those efforts, at least in terms of the creation of more companies among our youngest age group. The last thing I wanted to mention was another worrying trend that I mentioned at the beginning, was this divergence between self-employed, sort of one-person, one-business shops and employer firms, which is the bottom line, which are the businesses that when they come into existence, they create 3, 4, 5, 6 employees. Now, the uptick, as I said before, over the last 3 years in self-employment is entirely recession-driven. I don't mean to paint that as a bad thing, because obviously it's not bad when people decide to sort of take their future into their own hands. And in terms of transitioning, many of these people who are self-employed will transition to employer firms at some point. I think that's the other major policy challenge for us going forward, for this country going forward, is how do we ease that transition? Can we ease that transition for people who are self-employed and they want to grow? How do we get more employer firms in this country? We simply haven't been getting more over the past 15 years, and particularly in the recession, we've been getting fewer. And those to us at least are the main policy challenges, and we can talk about different ideas from you, the audience, and sort of we've been thinking. I know Mary Ann will have a lot of thoughts on that, but so that concludes at least what I wanted to say on this portion of it.
All right, thanks, Dane. I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts, and we certainly appreciate the work that the Kauffman Foundation brings to this particular area. Again, if you have questions for Mr. Stangler or for our next speaker, you may type them into the GoToWebinar interface at any time, and we'll be able to see those, and then during our question and answer portion be able to try to get some answers there. Our next speaker is Dr. Mary Ann Feldman, who serves as the S.K. Henninger Distinguished Chair in Public Policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Mary Ann, are you with us?
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. We hear you loud and clear.
Very good. So I'm glad.
No echoes at all. No echoes at all. Although I will say that I do not have your presentation.
Oh, goodness. So what shall we do about that? I did send it to you. What would you suggest we do, John?
Do you have it there in front of you?
I do have it here, and I can try to pull it up. I'm not, I have a better idea, which is that how about if I just talk? And
there you go. That's what we thought about as well. So yeah, we can always, and for those who are interested in seeing the slides, we can always sync them up in the archived module later on.
Very good. Okay, so it's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak with you, and I'm really going to shift the focus a little bit. We've now looked at, Dane has presented trends in entrepreneurial activity, and I really want to focus on a very specific question, which is that if you are responsible for economic growth in a local area, what might you do? And how could you create a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship? And it's sort of funny as we think that we are now in an era of globalization, that while production globalizes, innovation, innovative activity, the creation of new knowledge, of patents, and of high growth firms has never been as geographically concentrated as we observe it to be currently. So while production searches for low costs, what we see is that innovative activity benefits from the increasing returns to ideas that are created in specific places. And so over time we get these virtuous self-reinforcing cycles where the idea that someone has an idea for starting a business and that they would go out and actually pursue that they would take the leap, becomes something that's very obvious. And what we see is that over time that entrepreneurs create clusters while they develop their firms. And so as new industries develop, entrepreneurs embedded in a place will create the conditions for that economic growth. And I think the big question is, how does this process get started? And I think there's been so much experimentation at the state level, and we're now getting to see some best practices. I think for a long time people were searching for what I like to call the economic development sausage machine, which seemed that you could line up a set of inputs, and then if you had a research university, if you had a venture capital industry, if you could attract more venture capital, if you could get people to network and connect, well, then you'd be much better off. And what we've seen is that, well, having those inputs is necessary, but it's not sufficient to really getting growth started. And for me in North Carolina, this has been just an opportunity to look at the research triangle and to try to understand how the North Carolina economy has changed and evolved over time. And so we start out with the North Carolina economy being very poor in the 50s when the Research Triangle Park began. And the park itself is one of the largest research parks in the United States. It joins 3 research universities. So the conventional wisdom is sort of build a research park and you have good universities, and then you will have entrepreneurship develop. But the devil is really in the details. And so what we see is that what makes a region dynamic are the entrepreneurial spawns that occur over time. And Dane alluded to this. While we think that universities are going to be important as a source of entrepreneurship, universities are probably more important as a source of ideas and also as a source of talent. When we look at the Research Triangle, what we see is that most of the entrepreneurs actually came from large companies, from the R&D labs that were located and that were attracted to the Research Triangle Park. And most of those companies get started as a result of restructuring or mergers or acquisitions. So people wanted to stay in the area and they sort of become entrepreneurs by necessity. Also, state policy played a large role in really creating preconditions that allowed people who had ideas, what we call nascent entrepreneurs, to realize their dreams. And so in North Carolina, we had some quasi-governmental entities like the Microelectronics Center, which was started in 1980, Biotech Center started in 1984. And they were really dedicated to promoting the development of the industry, that specific sector, understanding what the industry needed and sort of adapting policy over time as the industry developed. Right now we see that 38 states have these quasi-public entities that are responsible for economic development. Another important institution here in the Research Triangle is the Council for Entrepreneurial Development. And so this was really private sector entrepreneurs and some people, attorneys, people who were doing financing, who thought that they really needed to get together and to try to create these conditions that would help entrepreneurs get their businesses started. And so what we see is this process really took about 50 years, which is a long and frustrating time if you are a state government official. RTP begins in 1959. It starts, entrepreneurship starts as a trickle in the 70s and then gains momentum. And so we're seeing more and more companies. And so I want to sort of think as we sort of focus on this question of an entrepreneurial culture. I think that the literature suggests that, well, we have to consider what is it that entrepreneurs want and provide them those conditions. And entrepreneurs are really best when they're singularly focused on growing their businesses. So they want a great deal of certainty in what they're doing. And we like to say that entrepreneurs are risk takers. And really, if you dig a little bit deeper and talk to entrepreneurs, they tend to be much more risk minimizers. They really are understanding a technology, a market very well, and so they want to sort of be able to get rid of as much risk, to download this as much as possible so that they can focus on growing their business. We see also that federal programs are really important to the development of small businesses. So specifically the SBIR, but other programs, TIP at the National Institutes of Science, of Standards and Technology. Programs are very important to the firms that get the money. We did a survey over the summer in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Akron, and Youngstown area and found that many firms don't even realize that they qualify for federal assistance. Firms find that local programs are really, really important, and the best local programs, things like Jumpstart in Cleveland, really focus on building one company at a time. So it is working intensively with an entrepreneur over time and helping them to develop their business. This is very expensive, and it is something, though, that becomes critical. Unfortunate thing is that the local programs tend to have much less money than the federal programs. And also, when we have this debate about what is it that entrepreneurs want, many times we are hearing that, well, no, they want tax breaks. They need tax breaks. But indeed, so few entrepreneurs are at the point where they are actually profitable and paying taxes that tax breaks are not going to help them very much. So I think that when we think about what defines an entrepreneurial place, what we sort of three factors I want to talk about. And so the first is this tolerance for experimentation. And the second thing I want to talk about is the idea of regional champions. And so what I mean by that are people who take responsibility for the stewardship of a local industry and a local economy and help to build it over time. And I want to talk about a specific group of people called Dealmakers. And Dealmakers are individuals that we find provide a good diagnostic of the health of a local entrepreneurial economy. And so regional champions, when we think about new products and how new products go from an idea and a concept to actually realizing profits on the market, we see in large companies that we have product champions. And when we look at places and successful places, what we see is that there are a category of people who champion a place. They take responsibility. They live in the place. They have a deep history and deep roots. And so they're willing to make long-term investments and investments in building an infrastructure and in building common resources and sharing that with people. It's a wonderful book called Startup Nation, which is the story of Israel's economic miracle. And it's not academic, it's very readable by two Wall Street Journal authors. And they ask the question of how is it that Israel, located in the Middle East, this very small country, has more companies that IPO on the NASDAQ than any other country in the world besides the United States. And they tell a wonderful story about how the Israeli economy is able to take adversity and turn it to their advantage. So having a strong military gives them this opportunity to innovate in information security. Having forced military service allows them to build a lot of trust among an elite core of talented people who go on to become entrepreneurs. But also having a set of investors who really believe in the future of this country and want to see it succeed is another important factor. And this is replicated in all successful clusters. What we see is that the most successful places have concentrations of individuals who are willing to take responsibility for a place. And you can sort of think about social capital within a place. And so we have groups of entrepreneurs and groups of investors. And we can sort of think about how they're all networked together and how dense and concentrated these connections are really will determine how information flows and how resources. And you sort of think about if you have a question, a technical question or a financing question or a marketing question and you're an entrepreneur, you want to be able to ask someone who will answer your question, and even if they don't know the answer, they'll know the guy who knows the guy who will be able to answer that and to give you the information that you want. And so what we see is that regional champions will broker information and resources within place. And they're also, while they are doing this sort of championing function, they're connecting people and they're shaping the local networks and making them more efficient and really creating a regional advantage that then makes the place a successful a successful entrepreneurial economy. And so we see, sort of every place will have a few entrepreneurs who will start companies, but being able to pick up, to gain this momentum, really depends on having connections between entrepreneurs through regional champions, and not just sort of loose connections, but people who are really invested in the future of the entrepreneurs. And so we have been sort of looking at regional champions and doing case studies of these. And what we see is that many times public officials are busy with so many other functions, and the sort of election cycles are short. People who tend to champion entrepreneurial economies are civic leaders. They tend also to be serial cashed-out entrepreneurs who reinvest in economies, and also service providers, attorneys, and accountants who are just logically making connections because they know what their clients are doing. Wanted to highlight in this talk, and sort of got some beautiful tables, but my colleague Ted Zoller has been doing work looking at Dealmakers, and Dealmakers as a subsection of regional champions, and defining these deal makers as people who have a fiduciary responsibility with a local company. So they live in a place, but they are also affiliated as either the founder, an executive, or someone on the board of directors. And as we look at this and examine regional economies, what we find is that the presence of these deal makers really correlates with regional entrepreneurial activity. And so most regional economies have a large variety of actors. And the other sort of artifact of this is that the total number of people who participate in an entrepreneurial economy is not at all correlated. It's not a function of the size of the place. And so certain regional economies just are more entrepreneurial. And so in most regional economies, actors, individuals who participate have one role. They're either an entrepreneur or an executive, and that's sort of 90% of all of the individuals. And then some individuals will have two roles. That is, they'll be a founder and maybe found several companies, or they'll be a founder of one and an executive of another. But then we get at three roles, individuals who are crossovers. So they're going to be both entrepreneurs, executives, and then also investors. And when you start getting people who have multiple roles in the economy, they are able to make these connections. And so it's a strong diagnostic of the culture and of what's going on in a specific place. So as we look at regional economies, what we see is that in Silicon Valley, when we think about, sort of how many people have three or more, how many actors in the entrepreneurial economy have three or more roles? Well, it's about 5%. When we look at Orange County, California, it's only about less than 1%. So within the same state, there still is this great amount of variation. And when we think about the sort of ratio of entrepreneurs to deal makers, it sort of suggests that if you are an entrepreneur and you're in a meeting of people, you're at some networking event, how likely is it that you're going to run into someone who's actually going to be able to address your questions? And so building an entrepreneurial economy is something that does take a while, and it really is going to be predicated on understanding that local context, understanding the individual entrepreneurs and their motivations, because that's going to vary depending on the demographic profile, where people have previously been employed, also the industry where entrepreneurs are working and the technologies that they're building out. And then also to understand the entrepreneurial culture, the value chain, understanding sort of the suppliers and the buyers and how that value chain is filled in suggests that you can find certain opportunities, that you can augment what goes on within an industry. I think that as we think about building out an entrepreneurial economy, that it's much easier to encourage people who are experienced, who have been working in corporations, to make a transition to entrepreneurship. And we need to balance policies between providing experience for people who are transitioning, and then also encouraging the garage entrepreneur. And I think that an entrepreneurial culture is something that you can develop and build very intentionally. So first, a matter of encouraging regional champions, and then celebrating the success of those individuals, so that so many times we only read about entrepreneurial firms in the newspaper once they've had a disaster. They've failed at a clinical trial, or they're going to cut employment. We are much less likely to hear about the success, the moving on to the next phase of a clinical trial, or investments of venture capital, or other sort of major events that are success and that we could celebrate. And when we celebrate entrepreneurship, we also sort of encourage individuals to become attached to their local area. I'm amazed as I travel around that so many places are trying to market their local economies to, well, certainly site selection firms, as that's become very important, but also to others, trying to attract individuals to think of their area more favorably. And yet we know that most entrepreneurs don't relocate when they start their firms, and that many people are really dedicated to places, but they're not getting the message. So we don't have much internal marketing about what a place is doing and what its message is and how attractive it is as a place to live. And I sort of want to leave with some sort of reconsiderations of evolutionary biology. And I think this is sort of instructive as we think about places, so that we used to sort of think about evolutionary biology as the survival of the fittest. And that is that we had competition, and competition pitted firms against one another, and it pitted places against one another, and it argued for deep specialization and a winner-take-all sort of mentality, a casino economy, if you will. And I think that more recent advances, and I think very prescriptive to this current economy, is that there are lots of advantages to developing immunity and to developing a resiliency within places. And so that is this ability to survive external shocks by having a diversified portfolio of bread and butter entrepreneurs, people who are growing slowly, and gazelles, and a more diversified portfolio of companies. We want to make sure always that whenever you have any shock, that enough members survive, and that also we don't ever really know where the best ideas are going to come from. And so that you want to encourage, again, this experimentation, this sort of learning and observation among people in a community. And sort of the last thing I'd like to say is that as we think about the evolution of regions and places and industries, that our economic development policy, entrepreneurial policy, needs to be equally adaptive. Thank you.
Dr. Feldman, thank you very much for your insights and thoughts on the subject. We're going to delve into questions now. We have a number of them that we've received so far. If you'd still like to ask one, we ask that you type it into the GoToWebinar interface in the expandable box marked questions, which should be on the right-hand side of your screens. Our first question comes from Kentucky, and it's addressed towards you, Dr. Feldman. You mentioned earlier that state policy played a large role in North Carolina's success in helping nascent entrepreneurs realize their dreams. What specifically are some of those policies, and how can other states help spark entrepreneurship?
Oh, that's a really good question. And so for specifically the Biotech Center, they had a lot of small seed grants that they made available, so things like $25,000, $50,000 individual companies. They were also helping them with patenting, helping defray patenting costs, and also giving them access to patent attorneys, sort of specialized services that they didn't have at the time, and really encouraging this sort of having a library where people could come and do patent searches as just sort of one example. So that was what is good, I think, about the North Carolina example is that they targeted biotech, and they targeted it very early in 1984. And so they were clearly on that bandwagon at an early point. Similar to Kentucky with your, is it Bucks for Brains, I think, program, which I think is great. We had an Eminent Scholars program that attracted a lot of talented individuals who were doing good research and producing high-quality students. And so it was this sort of synergy and kind of give and take. Now, this North Carolina Biotech Center, and let me just mention, one of the wonderful things that they did was when they set up their board of directors, they included 32 people, which I think is unwieldy as a board. But the beautiful thing about it was that they stipulated that they had a geographic representation and also different industries that were represented. And they really had a process of developing a consensus for what it is that the industry might look like, and also understanding what individual entrepreneurs and companies needed. And so developing things like shared biomanufacturing capability over time.
Very good. I think you're both pretty popular in Kentucky today. We have another one from that state. What would you recommend to states to assist entrepreneurs to promote themselves?
Dane, do you want to go ahead?
Is that for both of us?
Sure.
The question was, what do we recommend for entrepreneurs to promote themselves?
Yes.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that sort of goes to Mary Ann's point and some of the research that her colleague Ted Zoller has done on, you know, the connections that you make. And Ted has this research, and Mary Ann, you can probably describe it better than I. Ted has this research focusing on what he calls dealmakers. That's sort of the people who are sort of those crucial nexus of connections. And, you know, that comes about, as Mary Ann knows, through, you know, both word of mouth and beating the street, but just sort of sheer persistence in terms of going out and talking to people. I mean, you know, lots of advertising isn't really an option for a lot of newer young companies, and even some more well-established companies. But I think it really comes down to, you know, personal networking sort of on a very ground-level basis.
And, you know, if I can just add, my observation of people who are blogging and also writing for newspapers and magazines is that they're always looking for stories. And so to make some connections with some newspaper, you know, newspaper people and other people who are blogging and telling them stories. And so entrepreneurs sometimes are so busy that they don't have the ability to do this. So I think that Dane is right, that we need sort of some kind of intermediary. And there's a, you know, sort of difference between really doing it and kind of telling the story. But I think cultivating, again, it's this sort of sense that the overall trajectory is you know, moving forward, and that this is a place of some growth and opportunity is just is something that really does have a big impact.
We've got another question for Mary Ann, this one from Nebraska. There's a lot of talk at the state level about restructuring state revenue streams, kind of new taxes and fees. What must state leaders look out for in these decisions so as not to stifle entrepreneurs and new startups? Kind of an unintended consequence question.
Right. No, I think that that is very critically important. And so, you know, as we're looking for new revenue sources, this sort of would be very easy to kill this goose that could lay a golden egg. And so I think it's critically important to exempt smaller, younger firms, to you know, to encourage this, you know, sort of to hold these, if you will, infant industries. It's the old economics infant industry argument, and so to make sure that there aren't these adverse effects, that the cost of starting a business should be as streamlined as possible, that all of the sort of permitting and things that people need, and that you know, that we are not unintentionally going to really hurt our future prospects for economic growth. And so I think it's a matter of just having that lens as you evaluate different policies.
All right. Another question, and I would remind folks that you can still send your questions in using the questions box on the left-hand side of your screens. Marian, at what level does infrastructure play into the success of a state's startups and helping to create kind of this entrepreneurial culture? I mean, it's almost as if you've got to have some things that would be attractive, but how much does that play into it?
Well, and you know, that's a good segue from the last question, because I think that as you levy taxes and fees, people don't mind paying taxes so much if there is a perceived benefit. And if they know what it is that they're going to get from these taxes, and if it's something that they value, I think that it's much easier. So infrastructure is, you know, it's sort of necessary. You're not going to have really much going on if you don't have infrastructure, if you don't have good transportation, and increasingly it's strong internet connectivity, and you know, this sort of you know, what's becoming infrastructure is really changing and evolving pretty rapidly with the needs of business. And then how do we pay for this in an era of diminished fiscal capacity is a challenge.
Very much so. Unless we have other questions from the group, I've got one last question for each of you. And Marianne, perhaps we'll start with you. Would you mute that real quick? For both of our panelists, Marianne, with you, what resources, kind of books, reports, or websites are going to be some of the best places for our attendees to explore if they really want to get inside the issue of entrepreneurism? I know you mentioned one book earlier, but are there kind of places that you visit regularly to find updates and get ideas?
Oh, you know, so I'm going to scoop Dane and say, you know, the Kauffman Foundation has just a great website, and so that's a wonderful, you know, a wonderful resource. I also like SSTI, the State Science and Technology Institute .org, and so they are really following a lot of policies. And I think also, John, your website is another wonderful source. And so the White House and the current administration nationally is promoting clusters and cluster development, cluster policy. So good resources there. And also the Center for American Progress has a regional innovation initiative. And so good information can be found there. So, you know, really there's no sort of dearth of information, and it goes back to the point that I want to make is that as state and local people search for what they're going to do, it's a matter of looking and surveying the landscape and then really understanding what's going to work in their specific context.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And Dane, what about some resources that you visit regularly, or even things that the Kauffman Foundation produces?
Sure. In terms of the Kauffman Foundation resources, I would highly recommend entrepreneurship.org, which is very much intended to be a site for not only policy practitioners but also entrepreneurs themselves. And we have sections on there, to deal specifically with things like law pertaining to entrepreneurs, and people have found that to be a great resource. In terms of resources for state and local policy people, I would sort of throw out three programs that I think really are sort of at the cutting edge of the country in terms of calling forth what we might see as latent entrepreneurs, and also sort of making those connections that Marianne talked about. And those are, the three are, one is Maker Faire, which many of you will be familiar with. Started in Silicon Valley, and they've expanded to other parts of the country. They just had a huge one in Detroit. They had nearly 100,000 people come out in Detroit. These are sort of your classic garage tinkerers, but there's so much potential there in terms of innovation and people making connections. The other one that's slightly more formalized than Maker Faire is Tech Shop. Also started in Silicon Valley, also expanding to other parts of the country, including Detroit. And Tech Shop is sort of, if you see it as like a fitness center or a gym for innovators, where you pay a monthly fee, $100, and you get access to just a panoply of cutting-edge equipment. And they have seen several extraordinarily innovative companies come out of there by people who never would have found each other otherwise, but for Tech Shop. So I think things like Tech Shop and Maker Faire, where you're making those but-for connections based around innovation and really cutting-edge ideas, are hugely promising. The other one, the last one I would mention, is this organization called Startup Weekend. And it's exactly what it sounds like, where it's 56 hours of people building a company. It started almost exclusively in the software sector, but sort of with some of our help, they're trying to branch out to not only other technologies, but also trying to see, can you build companies like that in non-tech sectors? And it's extraordinary, not only in terms of the connections people make, the companies that come out of there, but it's extremely cost-effective. I just saw a story the other day that did a tally for Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, like $100 million had been spent on fiscal stimulus, and they created 55 net jobs. And Startup Weekend held a couple of events, and they created 40 jobs at a cost of $18,000. And so these are sort of those cutting-edge things that are making those connections, calling forth people who want to be entrepreneurs, don't know they're entrepreneurs, but are extraordinarily high potential entrepreneurs.
All right, very good. That's all the time we have for today's webinar session. I want to again thank both of our speakers for their presentations and their comments this afternoon, and thanks also to everyone who registered and participated in the webinar.